All right, so we've learned about separation of powers, we learned about checks and balances, we learned about the legislative branch. Now it's time to talk about one of the branches that some of us have most of our background and knowledge in, which is the executive branch, which is the President of the United States. So, under the Constitution, the President serves as the head of the state and head of the government. So pretty much they have the biggest role that is given to one single person. So the president is given 4-year terms, who gets from the 4-year terms granted powers as the head of the military, make treaties and appointments, propose legislation, and address Congress. So not only do they work with Congress, they can address it and stuff like that. They can also obviously go for 2 terms, but after that, there is no more terms that the president can run for. There's also the Electoral College, which was created to ensure the president would not be a political outsider, making sure that they still had an impact within each state. Because they're just in Washington, D.C., but they're also the head of the state, they also need to have an impact there as well. Qualifications for the president come from at least 35, natural-born citizen, 14 years of residency. So unfortunately, I don't think any of us are there yet to be prepared to be president, although we have maybe 1 or 2 of us in the future that could have that opportunity. Since the powers were created, the presidential influence has actually grown quite a bit. Executive orders have been created to improve that power. Mass media have increased the president's power as well. So as we move forward, the president becomes more and more important, and also, for lots of the aspects, become more and more powerful as well. So, as I just said, the president has great many roles these days, and they've only been bigger and bigger as time has moved forward. So they're the commander-in-chief, which means that they're head of the military, the chief of state, so they are the top official of the U.S. government, chief diplomat, head of U.S. foreign policy, which means they work with other countries, chief executive, top administrative of federal bureaucracy, which means that they are once again the head of the institution and the federal government. Chief legislator can propose or rally support for legislation. They can make more influence and make more changes than any senator. They're also the moral leader. They are also expected, to be the display, to be kind of what our nation embodies. That's kind of another role of the president that isn't necessarily expressed, but is expected. They also the party leader. Obviously, whatever party is in the head of the government, today that being usually Republican or Democrat, they're also a member of that party still. Just because they become president doesn't mean that that power is now gone and they're no longer representing that party. They are still not only representing that party, they're the biggest representation of that party. They also have that pressure as well. So, many different roles. The president wears many different hats and is incredibly important in many different factors. And like we mentioned, that is why they're considered, the top of the federal government and the top of our nation, and a kind of a moral of our nation and the role that we follow. So to fulfill these roles, though, the president needs a lot of help. This is a lot of responsibility. So in order to do this, he needs to create positions and appoint positions to make sure that he will be successful. So, kind of like the legislative branch is broken into 2 separate groups, even the executive branch is divided into 3 groups. There's the executive office of the president, which is a complex organization of several separate agencies staffed by president's closest advisors, the budget, national security, economy, environment. There's also executive departments, 15 specialized agencies, each headed by a secretary, Secretary of State. There's also Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, and so forth. These are what they call the cabinet. This is what the president appoints to make sure that he still is the head of everything, but he understands he can't take on all these responsibilities. He has to set different people to be the head of that. Which is why the president's cabinet is usually a very important thing and always viewed as whether the president's going to be successful or not successful, kind of based on the cabinet and the positions he appointed. There's also independent agencies set up outside the executive branch to avoid partisan politics. Once again, there's even kind of checks and balances and separation of powers within the executive power too, to make sure that there's not too much power under one person. There's the SEC, the FEC, National Labor Board, the CIA, and stuff like that. So different institutions set up to take the responsibilities of the executive branch and to make sure that not only are each and every one being fulfilled, but making sure that not one person's attempting to do them all, because that is just too much to ask of one person, and because it would create too much power for one person. So once again, checks and balances even within each of our biggest and federal powers.
This episode of Crash Course is brought to you by Squarespace.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about the most powerful person in the U.S. No, not Chris Hemsworth, although he is powerful in a physical sense. We're talking about the President of the U.S., who right now is Barack Obama, but that's the last we'll mention him specifically. Instead, we'll examine the office of the presidency and what makes whoever holds the office so powerful. We're also going to talk about what makes him, and so far the president has always been a him, less powerful than you might think. So you might have noticed a trend in these episodes that we like to start with what the Constitution says about the branches of government. That's not just because it's what appears on tests or what strict constructionist Justice Scalia would want us to do. We start with the Constitution because it gives us a formal description of the branch, in this case the executive, upon which we can build. What do you mean, upon which we can build? That's nonsense. The Constitution is a limited document. It lays the framework and the rules, and that's all. All this extra stuff is an unconstitutional power grab. Oh, clone from the right. I was wondering what happened to you clones. That's a good point you make, but really, the world is more complicated than it was in 1787, and we need to have a more flexible government. The Constitution provides a framework for understanding it, but it needs to change with the times. Besides, if the president becomes more powerful than what's suggested in the Constitution, whose fault is that? Congress. That's who. Okay, clones, we get the picture. There's a debate about the role of the Constitution in setting up the government, and we're not going to solve it today. For now, we're going to start with the Constitution and what it says about the president. You win this round, clone from the right. All right, let's try to keep those convos in the clone zone going forward. Thank you. Anyway, as with Congress, the Constitution lays out certain qualifications for the presidency. If you want to be president of the U.S., and I know you do, you must be 35 years old, which in the 1780s was actually pretty old. You were expected to have moved out of your parents' house by that point. And you must be a citizen of the U.S. who was born in the United States, or one of its territories. The president is not elected directly by the American people. Yeah, your mind is blown. In the Constitution, as originally written, only members of the House of Representatives were directly elected by qualified citizens. The president is actually chosen by the Electoral College, which is complicated and frustrating for many Americans, and we're not going to go into it now, except to say that the reason it exists is that the framers didn't trust the popular vote all that much. So they built in the Electoral College as a safeguard against the people electing scary demagogues, or the person they wanted elected. Some people say that this is not particularly democratic, mostly because it's not particularly democratic. So democratically elected or not, the president is pretty powerful, but he has different categories of powers. What are they? First, he has military powers to send soldiers and planes and ships to do military things. He also has judicial powers in that he appoints federal judges and Supreme Court judges, subject to Senate approval, of course. He is the nation's chief diplomat, which is the source of his foreign policy power. The president can also propose laws, although he has to get a congressman or senator to actually introduce them into Congress. This is a legislative power. And since he's the chief executive, he also has executive power, which means that he's supposed to ensure that the laws are carried out. This is his most far-reaching power, probably because it's the least well-defined. Executive power is a pretty big deal, so we're going to give that its own episode. Another way to describe the president's powers is as either formal or informal. Formal powers are the ones we can find in the Constitution itself, mainly in Article 2. The informal powers come either from Congress or the president himself. But for now, let's look at the formal powers, which, like those given to Congress, are also known as express powers. Let's go to the thought bubble. Unfortunately, presidents don't derive their powers from the sun, like Superman, or from exposure to radiation, like the Fantastic Four or the Hulk. Their powers come from the Constitution, which, again, unfortunately, doesn't have any supernatural or mystical power, although some people like to think it does. The first power given to the president in the Constitution is that he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which at the time was just the Army and Navy, since there were no airplanes. There's a reason why this should be the first power. If there's one thing that almost everyone can agree on, it's that the first job of government is to keep its citizens safe, especially from foreign invasion. The U.S. has had a lot of generals become president. Washington, Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Taylor, Grant, Eisenhower, and many others have served in the military, but only one president has led the U.S. troops in the field while he was president, and that was George Washington. The Whiskey Rebellion. That's something worth fighting over. The president has diplomatic powers, although he doesn't actually do most of the diplomacy. The president has the power to make treaties, which are mostly written by the State Department officials, but he takes credit. He appoints ambassadors and those State Department officials I just mentioned. His most visible foreign policy power is to receive ambassadors, which not only makes for great photo opportunities, selfie, but also is a significant power because receiving an ambassador effectively means recognition of that ambassador's country's existence. So the president can actually legitimize a nation state. Maybe he does have superpowers. The Constitution requires that the president from time to time inform Congress of the State of the Union. This takes the form of an annual State of the Union address. Historically, presidents did this in writing, although George Washington made a formal address. We have Woodrow Wilson to thank for reviving the practice of making the State of the Union an actual speech, which now appears on television early each year. This may not seem like much of a power, but the State of the Union is a chance for the president to set a policy agenda for the next year, and it can put some pressure on Congress to make policies. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the president has a couple of other powers we've already talked about. The president has a formal legislative power to veto laws passed by Congress. He also has the power to convene Congress into special sessions. The president also has judicial powers. He can appoint judges, but only with the consent of the Senate. He does have the power to grant pardons and reprieves, which doesn't sound like a big deal unless you're in jail or threatened by criminal prosecution, in which case it's a very big deal. So there you have it. Those are the formal constitutional powers of the President of the United States. You may have noticed that there aren't all that many of them, which is kind of the point. The framers of the Constitution wanted a limited government, one that couldn't oppress the people. They were especially afraid of a strong executive like a king in charge of a standing army, so they deliberately tried to curtail his powers by not giving him very many. But as we'll see in the next few episodes, over the course of the last 240 years or so, the powers of the president have expanded far beyond what the framers probably envisioned. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. I can feel my powers expanding. Is this radioactive coffee? Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. Support for Crash Course U.S. Government comes from Vocal. Vocal supports nonprofits that use technology and media to advance social equity. Learn more about their mission and initiatives at vocal.org. Crash Course was made with the help of all these superheroes. Thanks for watching.
Well, once again, hope you guys enjoyed that video. I know I certainly like them. So for tomorrow, what to prepare for is really what are expressed and implied powers. We've talked about them in the legislative branch and in the executive branch. So really, what are they? And we're going to have a different couple of activities to look at. Are these going to be express powers of the president, or are they implied powers? And what does that mean specifically? So another opportunity to make sure that we understand this completely. And furthermore, what are the specific powers of the executive branch?